Let me now thank the GMF for the partnership in this event. We go a long way back. We started our partnership in 2016. And months before Trump was elected, and just 1 month after Brexit was approved in the UK. And since the very beginning, since inception, we were concerned about the effects of the wave of right-wing nationalism in the international system. The subject today is not exactly the same, but I think it is strictly connected, right? Why are we interested in the war in Ukraine? When I say we, I mean the Brazilians. Not so much, not only because of its short-term economic effects on fuel prices, commodity prices, the disruption of supply chains, but chiefly because of its long-term effects in multidimensional ways on the international system. Most probably than not, the war in Ukraine and its unfoldings will prove to be a watershed moment in the history, in the contemporary history of the international system. And to say something which is obvious, but I think it's important to state it now, Brazil is part of the world, and our best interests, long-term ones, will only be served well in a global order where cooperation prevails over competition. A more Hobbesian world will not be in favor of Brazilian long-term interests. So this is the angle from which we see this conflict. This will be the focus of our conversation today, not so much the short-term economic effects of the war, but the long effects of the unfolding war in Ukraine in its multidimensional aspects of the international life, ranging from security to the environment, encompassing trade and investment. And with this in mind, we have chosen our lead-in discussions. From our side, I would say, from the Brazilian side, that's the reason why we have invited ex-minister Celso Laffer, who has been written on the subject of the international order, have a direct experience in dealing with multidimensional issues of the international order in a very practical way, and who is uniquely prepared to give a Brazilian perspective on the subject. Oliver Stunkel, who is joining us soon, he had to take his young son, a baby, to the pediatrician. So family first, but he will be joining us in a minute. And Oliver,
I just joined. Good morning.
Oh, you're there. So good to see you. So good to see you. Oliver is Brazilian and German, right? So he covers both perspectives in this discussion. So I don't like to consume too much of our precious time here. I would like to give the floor to Ian. Ian will have to play a more protagonist role than initially planned to fill up the void created by the last-minute problem that precluded Carl Bill to participate in our conversation. But I think we are well served with Ian, who is a top-notch analyst and a senior fellow of the GMF. So Ian, you're going to play a double role of the moderator together with me and of a lead-in discussant. And now, please, the floor is yours.
Sergio, thank you very much. And it's great to be with you all. It's great to have another step in this as you say, very, very wonderful collaboration that we've had over the last years on another really important topic. And it will be great to hear the Brazilian perspective on that. I bring a little bit the American perspective as well, and colleagues with me here will also bring the European perspective, if I can say, from, to introduce sort of, as it were, from this side of the Atlantic. We have with us also Elena Lazaro, who is the acting head of the External Policies Unit of the European Parliament Research Service, and also my colleague, Jacob Kierkegaard, who is actually dual-hatted between GMF and the Peterson Institute in Washington, although he's here in Brussels with us. In fact, he's not here in Brussels with us today. He's flying back from Copenhagen and the flight was late. So he is still planning to join us as a discussant, but it may be towards the end of our discussion. But in the meantime, we'll do our best. So maybe with that, Sergio, if I could just to take advantage of your giving me a little bit more opportunity to say something from my side, I mean, and just make a couple of points to you from kind of a kind of European American perspective, if I can say. I mean, the first point is a very obvious one. I think the war in Ukraine, confronts us with a structural and very dangerous confrontation. I don't think we're in a kind of mode of crisis management here, although there are aspects of that. I mean, this is really something that is, as you say, a watershed in many terms, geopolitically, geoeconomically, in direct security military terms. And it's very dangerous. You often hear it said, and Biden has used this analogy, that it's the most dangerous security confrontation in a generation in Europe. I think that's wrong. Actually, I think it's the most dangerous one since 1945. Many reasons for that. One thinks back to the Cold War. The Cold War was, after all, a Cold War, and it had its rules. And for the most part, it was a fairly stable confrontation in which we pretty much understood each other, even if we didn't agree. We're in a very different situation today, where even if some of the inflated, sort of saber rattling and rhetoric is in fact exactly that, the possibility for something to go very badly wrong and turn into a hot war between Russia and the West more broadly is absolutely there. We could say more about that. But I think that's something that we need to reflect on, the immediacy, but also the likely durability of this crisis that we're facing. The second point I would make, it's very obvious to me here in Brussels, is the geographic immediacy of this for Europe. The border with Ukraine is a 12-hour drive from Brussels, if there's no traffic. And, so this is, and we have something like 4 million or so, many of them have gone back already, actually, but refugees from Ukraine now spread all over Western Europe, not just in Poland. And this has had a number of different effects, not least the fact that societies, I think, in Europe, to a lesser extent in the United States, but it's visible there too, are emotionally engaged in this crisis, in this confrontation. They're mobilized. They're putting pressure on governments. You can see this very directly in the seesawing of the German policy towards the war. Even in the last days, you never know what you're going to find the next day. And it's all the result of public and political pressure, some of it very unexpected. So, I mean, there's a human dimension to this, which is also having political effects. And the third, point and last point I would make is that it leaves us, I think this is really for our discussion, a set of open questions, which we will all have different perspectives on. And I'm very interested in hearing the Brazilian perspective on it. What if we're, to think about the geoeconomics of this, we're headed towards, maybe we were already headed towards it, but the war has accelerated it, a kind of, not an end of globalization, but a kind of globalization by invitation. Who's going to be invited? In that context, even if you're geographically quite remote from this war, you still have a very big stake in it, it seems to me. Will Brazil be invited? Will others be invited? Open question. The return of values is a very strong aspect of this debate, no question about it. I think we are in many ways around this virtual table rather like-minded, but not exactly maybe, and that's worth talking about. And because it's a long-term, finally, because it's a long-term issue, it seems to me, there are sort of basic ideas about deterrence, above all, that are going to have to be re-examined. We thought we understood what we meant by some of this, but it's really in some ways turned this upside down. We had thought about deterrence in terms of rational, predictable actors, cautious actors. We thought about it in terms of crazy states. We hadn't really thought about it in terms of simply ruthlessness. And I think we, in our broader thinking, not just about nuclear deterrence, but also about the international system, maybe have to come to terms with a higher degree of ruthlessness in the future than we're all likely to be comfortable with. So anyway, Sergio, I'm going to stop with that, and maybe I'll take a rest and give it back to you.
All right. And before I give the floor to Celso Laffer, let me ask all participants to keep their mics mute while the conversation is going on to avoid background noise. Second thing is to tell people in the audience that the interpretation service is already available. So having said that, Professor Celso Laffer, the floor is yours for around 10 minutes.
I will start with a very suggestive observation of Hannah Arendt that comes to my mind, stopping to think about the war in Ukraine. The quote is, "We are of the world and not merely in it." War in the contemporary scene, even more than in the past, does not circumscribe itself to the parties in conflict. It has a global repercussion in an interwoven planetary system characterized by the porosity of frontiers that dilutes the difference between the internal and the external. Its commotion, deadly changes, and miseries affect the international community as a whole. Such is the case of the ongoing war in Ukraine, unleashed by the unilateral aggression of Putin's Russia. It is a war of choice and implies the use of force to obtain political ends. These ends question the territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine and are in opposition to the principles of the UN Charter and the rules of international law. Underlying these rules and principles is a shared political perception that they are a key ingredient for the international cohabitation of the plurality and heterogeneity of great and small powers that make up the international system. They enhance the constructive work of diplomacy and the peaceful settlement of disputes, favoring a more hospitable world order. It is one of the functions of international law to inform what are the acceptable patterns of conduct and consequently to insert components of previsibility in the international life. Putin's actions and decisions as the head of state of Russia is a wide-reaching rupture of acceptable patterns of conduct in international life. They have, by their scope, magnified tensions, risks, and uncertainties with the general repercussions of a war that extends to all instances of international relations. That is why I believe, as Ian has said, that it is a watershed. This is a fact recognized by the overwhelming majority of the international community, including Brazil, in very significant UN resolutions of the General Assembly. In this context, Russia's diplomatic isolation increases as Putin escalates the conduct of war, faced with the resolute defense of Ukraine's Zelensky of the independence and territorial integrity of his country, in which he is helped by the aid of weapons channeled by friendly countries of his cause. This is occurring in spite of disproportional military resources at play in this deadly conflict. As always, and especially in this case, with its all-encompassing lethal dimensions, war looms in the realm of uncertainty and contingency. The architecture of the international system has regional components, and there are discontinuities in the way regions are affected by the intensities of the reach of the war in Ukraine. Certainly, these intensities are paramount in Europe, and we will have the opportunity to grasp their many aspects in the interventions of the experienced speakers of this webinar. The war has increased some specific vulnerabilities of the Brazilian economy, but I will not elaborate a catalog of them. I rather will try to deal with the general complexity of what I perceive as a very significant elements that are of great impact in the international sphere. Let me start with the issues of security, war, and violence that are the limit situation of international life. In an international system, peace is an elusive conquest of political reason and diplomacy. It requires to be sustainable a framework that acknowledges that states have different vital interests and that the reasoned foreign policy will strive in dealing with these issues for a de facto and de jure institutionalization of common interests in taking out the deadly sting of hostile Hobbesian confrontations. The realist rule of thumb of such a framework is to bear in mind, as Kissinger has stated in so many of his reflections, that the search for absolute security on one side means absolute insecurity for all other sides. Thus, a framework of this type is based on a relative security and therefore relative insecurity of all, with adequate adjustments within this framework. This has characterized world order since the end of World War II, including the management of nuclear weapons and the containment of war of conquest devoted to the enlargement of vital space. This is a point Ian mentioned in his quick intervention. Russia's quest with the war in Ukraine is a quest for absolute security through the enlargement of its vital space. As a result, it has brought about the absolute insecurity not only for the neighboring countries and the regional context of Europe. As a consequence of the scope of action of a great military nuclear power, it implies relevant risks and uncertainties for the world order that encompasses the threat of nuclear weapons and the increase of military nuclear proliferation. That is why Russia's war of aggression is at the same time politically unacceptable and legally illicit for the international community and has the dimension of a diffuse tension of hegemony that is a byproduct of the end of the Soviet Union. Let me now turn to the normative aspirations of the international agenda that came to the forefront after the precedents and horrors of World War II. They were contemplated in the UN Charter and led to the internationalization of human rights that became a global theme in their interdependence, and indivisibility. This, of course, includes humanitarian law and the development of international criminal law with the specification of war crimes, and of course, conventions on refugees that deal with displaced people, such as the case of the present Ukrainians in Western Europe. The diplomatic peril in dealing with human rights in the international sphere is political selectivity. There is no selectivity in the evaluation of Russia's war conduct in Ukraine that ignores the rules of jus in bello. The international community has overwhelmingly recognized the scale, unseen in many decades, of humanitarian woes of Russian military operations in Ukraine. We are all aware of this through the cyberspace of the digital era. The use of force does not bring about legitimacy, which in the international sphere is the framework for the acceptable space of initiatives and actions. And of course, as mentioned, the role of international law, including in the area of human rights, is to inform the pattern of acceptable conduct. Russia's conduct of military operations in Ukraine goes way beyond acceptable patterns, blending in an unprecedented way illegality with illegitimacy, which explains its growing diplomatic isolation. If it is as if Putin has lost touch with the fact that he is of the world and not merely in it. Russia is denying the Ukrainians proper right to the hospitality of Earth's surface, which the human race shares in common, and is creating a situation where violations of rights in one part of the world is felt everywhere to summon forth Kant in perpetual peace. This is a dimension of the sentimental and axiological situation that the refugees in Europe bring forth. The impact of war in international economic life is very significant and has been intensified by sanctions. It has affected the oil and gas market and their price, international logistics, the interrelationships of productive and supply chains, the trade and price of wheat, the functioning of international financial markets, induce inflation to stress some of the issues that are present in the international economic agenda. It has implications for worldwide food security. In the case of Brazil, this overall situation increases some of the economic vulnerabilities of Brazilian economy, for instance, the imports of fertilizers and wheat. A word on sanctions. Sanctions are measures taken to respond to the lack of compliance of the rules of law, which is the clear case of Russia's conduct on the ongoing war of aggression in Ukraine. These sanctions are plurilateral economic sanctions, and they are sweeping, and they affect Russia, but have a spillover effect in international economic life. They find justification, I think, in the security exceptions contemplated by the WTO that do not prevent actions for protection of essential security interests taken in time of war or other emergency in international relations. In this case, they are related to a conflict of hegemony that will influence the world order. It remains to be seen if they will mitigate the impacts of the intransitivity of the Russian a la Carl Schmitt, publicum bellum of an amicus inimicus confrontation that underlies the war in Ukraine and can stimulate, with the aid of diplomatic initiatives of other states and institutions, acting as tertius justas partes, to bring forth an accommodation that goes beyond an indispensable ceasefire. A concluding remark on Brazil's position. Brazil has locus standi in the international system. Throughout the decades, Brazilian foreign policy has dealt with the country's specific interests and has been concerned with the general interests of the functioning of the world order that always have implications for the country's place in the international system. Brazil is a huge continental country in South America that has settled its frontiers through arbitration and diplomatic negotiations and lives in peace with its 10 neighbors. Few countries have as many neighbors as we do, and few countries live in peace and have lived in peace throughout the years with its 10 neighbors. This is a diplomatic asset of Brazil that differentiates the countries from others of a continental scale, I will not spell them, that have pending territorial disputes. As a middle power of relevance, the Brazilian diplomatic tradition has given emphasis to diplomacy, to the role of international law, and the denial of war of conquest. The Brazilian Constitution of '88, the constitution of the direct democratization of the country, has incorporated facets of this diplomatic tradition, setting up principles that should guide Brazil's presence in the international sphere. Among them, the defense of peace, peaceful settlement of disputes, international cooperations, and the prevalence of human rights. Following the country's diplomatic tradition and the principles of the Constitution that are aligned with the UN Charter, Brazil has converged with the overwhelming majority of the international community in condemning as illicit Russia's aggression in the war in Ukraine. In my view, Brazil, in its voting declarations in the UN and in other fora, has modulated the country's position to a greater extent that is adequate, considering the scope of the issues that are present that I have tried to explore in my intervention.
Thank you, Celso, for your conceptually well-built presentation that sets the framework for our discussion. You elegantly stated your criticism against the Brazilian position, if I have understood it correctly, saying that basically we took the right position in condemning the invasion, but we haven't taken the consequences coming from it that should commensurate to the level of aggression suffered by Ukraine. But this is my interpretation, not necessarily yours. Now I'll give the floor to Oliver, who is somewhere on the screen. Oliver, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Sergio. It's been a great pleasure to be part of this discussion. And I think I agree with all the previous speakers so far that this is clearly a watershed situation. I think that 50 years from now, this conflict will certainly have in the history books about the early phase of the 21st century, much greater space than the war on terror and the aftermath of September 11th, because in the end, it didn't really fundamentally alter the nature of global order, whereas now we're actually discussing the risk of great power conflict, which is obviously very, very different from what we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq. I also think that the war is basically yet another chapter accelerating, advancing a trend we've been seeing since 2000 and I would say 14, when in the late stage of the Obama administration, a consensus emerged that the big strategic bet articulated by the United States, that differently from all major powers in the history, that it would be possible to integrate emerging powers into a US-led liberal order rather than containing these powers, that consensus basically ended. Which, interestingly enough, it was just now in February 50 years that Nixon had made his famous trip to China to seek to bring China into the international order. And I think we've seen that fairly welcoming approach by the United States with Russia too. There was really an unprecedented attempt to integrate Russia into the Western-led liberal order. symbolized by Clinton's invitation to Yeltsin for Russia to join the World Trade Organization. But since then, and Trump was just a symptom of that ongoing trend, greater concern about whether that would be possible, also greater concern with globalization in itself, Brexit, and also the pandemic, I think, contributed to the reemergence of nationalism of a much less globalized world, much broader interpretation of governments of what counts as strategic interest. And so I think we'll see a less open world, a more regionalized world in which geopolitics always plays a role, very different from what we've seen over the past 30 years when multinationals basically could do their business without having to bother to read the political news section of the newspaper. And in a way, I think the war in Ukraine just aggravates that further. It's another blow to the post-war Cold War system. And I think it is in that sense, and I agree with what the others have said, it's of course a point of concern for Brazil, a country that has benefited from this order. It's a country that lacks hard power, and a key element of its capacity to project its influence and defend its national interest is its superb capacity to act on multilateral platforms, right? There's a long literature on Brazil's capacity to defend its interests in the World Trade Organization and at the G20, and that order may no longer exist now. It's interesting how few people have discussed this. I'm not entirely sure, for example, if the G20 will continue to exist. I can't really imagine Biden traveling to Bali in October for the G20 and shaking Putin's hand. So this will be a world, I think, in which there's much less space for multilateralism in general. So you would expect Brazil to be sort of leading the charge against Russia. But in fact, I don't think Brazil is doing that. I think what we're seeing, in fact, is that the liberal order is not global at all. I mean, Brazil has joined two resolutions condemning Russia, but in the end, it has no interest whatsoever to actually punish Russia. It depends on fertilizers from Russia. And the BRICS countries have actively worked against Western efforts to isolate Russia, just like in 2014, by the way, when there was tremendous pressure on President Rousseff to disinvite Vladimir Putin from the BRICS summit, which was taking place in Fortaleza in July. And Brazil decided to keep quiet, not only to keep quiet, but to guarantee that Russia would not be isolated diplomatically. And I think we must be very open and explicit about this. Russia could not have invaded Ukraine without the BRICS. It does have a backing. It knows that there will be no serious criticism from the BRICS countries, particularly China. And there's no coincidence here. I mean, Vladimir Putin met Xi Jinping a month before the invasion, announced an agreement of a friendship without limitations, a limitless friendship, and a month later invaded Ukraine because he knew that the West would react to some extent like it did. I mean, he I think, underestimated Western resolve, but he could not have done what he did without China's backing. And in a way, Russia now is hugely dependent on the BRICS countries, and he knows the BRICS countries will not isolate Russia diplomatically or economically. Brazil, India, and the vast majority of the global South does not agree with Western sanctions against Russia. It doesn't agree with Western attempts to kick Russia out of the G20. And Russia knows that. And I think, of course, Brazil has sought to take a step back like it did in 2014 to say, this is none of our business in a way. But, bilateral trade between Brazil and Russia increased dramatically after 2014 from a low base because Brazilian products were beginning to substitute Western products that were leaving the shelves of Russian shops. I was in Russia in 2015, and several of my Russian friends took me to the supermarket to show me Brazilian products. And the same will happen now. Russia will be isolated even more economically in the West, and will look for substitutes, and Brazil will stand ready to strengthen its trade relationship with Russia. And the question is, why is that? Why doesn't Brazil take a stronger stance? And I think that's because even though Brazil is an active supporter of multilateral order, it has deep-seated concerns about Western-led or particularly US-led liberal order, about US-led hegemony. And we can just look at the end of the Cold War. There were no frantic celebrations in Brazil at the time. There was all awareness about what an unrestrained hegemon would mean for Brazil and Latin America as a whole, for obvious reasons, for historic reasons. So the relationship that Brazil had with other centers of power, like Russia, like China, was always crucial for Brazil to balance the United States in Latin America. And that explains why across the ideological spectrum in Brazil, no one supports imposing sanctions on Russia. It's not a proposal, it doesn't exist. No one supports siding fully with the West in its attempt to truly contain and bring Russia to its economic collapse. That's what basically now, I mean, when we're seeing what the Western strategy is, it is to inflict such devastating economic damage on Russia that will not consider attacking other countries. Europe is something that, I probably advise Western policymakers to do as well. But Brazil's in a very different position, in part because participating in the sanctions, and as Celso has correctly pointed out, even the Western sanctions now, as they stand against Russia, will have a devastating impact on the global South. Developing countries have much less leeway to utilize economic sanctions. They have to be more pragmatic, and they have to act more according to realpolitik, which is exactly what Brazil is doing right now. It is seeking to preserve its trade relationships to Russia, to the West, to everyone. And I have no doubt that Brazil would continue to trade with China, even if China invaded Taiwan tomorrow. It doesn't have the luxury of acting in a way of, let's say, putting values on, the number one priority, and allowing that to affect its economic interests. And I think that will, just to finish, will be quite frustrating for the West. I know for a fact that Western diplomats were frustrated with Brazil in 2014. And I think that as the relationship between the West and Russia, and the West and China, by the way, and I think that's something we are sensing now in Europe. A lot of people are saying, we have to prepare for the fact that something similar will happen with China. So I agree, values will be yet again sort of at the center. We'll now have hardcore geopolitics back in the game. And I think that will potentially affect the West's, or let's say the Northern Atlantic community's relationship to Brazil, because Brazil will not go along with, further isolating Russia in the same way that Brazil did not go along at all with reducing the role of Huawei in Brazil, now that the country is building its 5G network. And just like the US-Brazil security relationship will suffer because the United States will be less willing to share sensitive information with Brazil, because Brazilians will talk to each other via a Chinese-built 5G network. The entire economy will function on a Chinese-built 5G network. And in the same way, I think that at some stage, the sanctions will go so far that they could become secondary sanctions. So Western companies or Western governments will threaten to punish companies in Brazil because they're continuing to do business with Russia. And I think that will be, whoever will win the election in Brazil in October, that will be a massive challenge to basically be on good terms with all the centers of power, even though there are massive tensions between those centers of power. Thank you. Back to you, Sergio.
Very good, Oliver. Very thought-provoking. Now, Elena, I guess.
Thank you very much. Thank you to GMF and the Instituto Fernando Henrique Cardoso for inviting me. Very interesting to listen to the previous perspectives. And I can also add that if two people have spoken about whether the G20 will continue or not with Russia in it, that's Oliver and me. We had that discussion. So that discussion has been had, at least between two people and many others. I was asked to speak about the EU perspective in these circumstances today. So what I wanted to do is talk a bit about that and what it means, what the reaction has been by the EU, and what we may see going forward. And then I'd like to also talk a bit about the greater geopolitical issues that I see, again, from Europe, but I do think that they will also have a direct impact on several actors, including Brazil and the US, which are the other two parties to this event today. Now, looking at the EU response and perspective, as I was asked, I think it's important, especially since we're speaking mostly to a Brazilian audience today, to think about how this war feels when one is sitting in Europe. And Ian alluded to how close it is. And just to say, at the macro perspective, the EU response has been quite complex and very multi-level, exactly because of the proximity. So on the one hand, the crisis is the war causes geopolitical and ideological reactions, but on the other hand, it's really a very tangible issue in Europe, which affects its supply chains, its sort of transportation routes, the flow of people into the EU, the actual defense of the borders of member states of the EU. So, of course, all that means that tangibly the response has been on many levels. And then, of course, it's important to remember two very interesting points. One is that the whole ahead of the invasion of Russia on Ukraine, the questioning by Putin of the European security architecture, the European security order, was very much addressed to against fundamentals of an environment in which the EU has operated and which it knows and which it takes as a prerequisite of its existence, the specificities of security in Europe as it has been formulated in the post-Cold War period. So in many ways, the Putin's actions and Putin's war on Ukraine, ideologically, I would argue, challenges the very fundamentals of the environment in which the EU operates, and in so doing also challenges and provokes it to react also in its own defense, in defense of its norms, of its values, of international law, and of its security. So really, I think when one is sitting in Europe, that context helps understand why this is also seen as a war, in quotation marks, on Europe. It's a war on European territory and against a lot of what has been part of what the EU and the European security architecture has been. And of course, on a second level, it comes at a very interesting moment, as many of you who have been following the EU will know. This year, 2022, is the fifth, or even more, I would argue, sixth in a row of years where the EU has been really rethinking its role as a global actor, where we've seen very significant developments in terms of the development of the EU's identity in security and defense, moves towards a more robust collaboration among European EU member states on developing a more concrete and more active defense policy, more assertiveness in the international environment as an actor, both in defense, as I mentioned, but increasingly, and perhaps most importantly, in the area of trade, of supply chain resilience, of the usage of economics, of economy and trade as an instrument to promote the EU's actorness. And so all of this is being now put at risk by the Russian. The implications of Russia's war in Ukraine, and at the same time challenging the EU to show that it is actually on the one hand, a unified actor that can take action and react as a power in such a situation, and on the other hand, challenging it to show that it can be indeed resilient and autonomous and strategic in its actorness. And so, for those who are studying EU foreign and security policy and the EU's global role, I think it's really the moment of truth having come a bit too early, as the EU has been developing all this strategic vision. But ideally, the moment to actually put it to the test would not have come in such a dramatic and shocking way. So this, of course, is a very EU Brussels-centric perspective, with the bigger perspective being that which Celso Laffer has alluded to, the greater challenge to everything essentially that we have known in the sort of liberal institutional world that we have been living in since the end of the Cold War, the rule of international law, elements of human rights, obviously, national sovereignty, and of course the sort of institutional multilateral structures set up to protect those. So this is where the EU stands. The discussion so far having been in that of building the EU as a strategically autonomous actor in the world. So this reaction to Russia's war on Ukraine was really, I think, a moment of truth, as I said, and one that perhaps showed relatively impressive results. That is the general feeling, obviously with the various criticisms that we read in the press. But just to touch very briefly on a few of the aspects on which the EU has reacted, but also on which it has been really challenged to react given the situation. I would mention the response of the EU first, with unprecedented coordination on 5 packages of sanctions. I won't go through them, but it is the first time that we've seen that degree of coordination, but also of commitment to sanctions that may hurt even the European economies. And yet we have seen those in a range of areas, from targeting individuals to sanctioning major Russian banks, sanctions on Russian aviation, sanctions on specific parts of the Russian energy sector, on the export of specific types of technologies. So all of this in a very, very large scale and coordinated to a very large degree with partners, Nordic partners, with the United States, with Japan, and other democracies. So the sanctions has been one of the main themes of the reaction, but there are also others, perhaps less apparent, but which perhaps elucidate or illustrate the degree to which this has touched on all sectors of many sectors of EU policy. So within the EU, there's been the activation of reactions on the humanitarian response level with regards to the refugees, which are now over 4 million, with regard to offering temporary protection and allowing them to work in the EU. Border management structures have been activated. Energy resilience policies have been debated. A big discussion is ongoing about how to boost quickly and efficiently domestic production of commodities that definitely will be in decline given the situation and the large degree to which Russia was providing them, such as specific food products and fertilizers. And of course, a big part of everything has been the energy issue and how to diversify energy and energy provision, and how to boost even further the production of alternative sources of energy. So really, if one puts all of this together, and then there could be more to add, I just don't want to go into details, but the maritime sector has been affected because of how many Ukrainian and Russian sailors there are, the truck drivers stuck in Ukraine or Russia who cannot bring products from China or elsewhere, aviation. So the interconnectedness of Europe with Russia and Ukraine, I think, is demonstrated to the highest degree through this crisis. And the response there is, of course, all the policies I have mentioned and more. And then, of course, there is the issue of what does this situation mean for the security architecture of Europe? And there, I think we've seen in a very concrete manner the return of the relevance of NATO. Obviously, in the past couple of decades, there have been moments where the relevance of NATO has been challenged at moments of more relative peace, but I think it's easy to say with quite a bit of certainty that NATO has become with the pillar of the security architecture. Again, we see formerly neutral or states or with a tendency to be neutral, such as Finland and Sweden, planning to apply for NATO membership. We've seen the EU itself commit much more funds to its own defense policy. We've seen the EU for the first time provide financial support for the provision of military equipment to Ukraine. So really establishing itself as an actor with military support capacity. So what we're seeing in many ways is a militarization of EU member states and a progress towards the EU itself being the locus of decisions on defense and security in Europe. So this is really, in my eyes, changing very much the essence of the balance between security and other policies in the EU, and it may have repercussions in the long term, because of course what we're seeing today is a huge pouring of money into the development of military capabilities and into defense budgets, including in Germany, but ultimately that will show and materialize even more strongly in 5 or 10 years. That's the defense cycle. So what we're going to see in 5 or 10 years is a much more military world, and this will change the face of how Europe looks. So on the back of that, then, there is the bigger geopolitical dimension that the previous speakers have been talking about. And here I think the EU as an actor is part of a much bigger global dynamic of shifts that are completely interrelated. And many of the previous speakers have mentioned this, that what Russia's actions have challenged many assumptions about the polarities of the world we are living, about the division, or rather the balance of power, but it's also even more interestingly and scarily challenged the existence of any type of rules or to govern international cooperation and global governance. My sense is that we see all actors in the international environment becoming very aware of that the geopolitics and the geoeconomics are changing and shifting, and in pursuit of alliances and partnerships in a very rapid way. And we see things like, for example, the BRICS coming up again, and they were kind of lethargic, and suddenly we're talking about the BRICS again. And that's just one of the many manifestations of how there is a search for alliances and sort of partnerships, which will, I think, ultimately are being sought out to support politically certain actors, but also to ensure that they have partners to trade with, because this is also a geo-economic crisis. And for me, there are 3 trends I think that we should be looking at in that context. The first is, as Oliver has alluded to, what happens to multilateralism as we know it? Will there be some kind of more global multilateralism, or will there be 2 types of multilateralism, or two sets of actors working together under different norms? In the same way that we're talking about the splinternet now and 2 different internets, will we be talking about 2 different arrangements of multilateral cooperation, where one includes more democratic actors only and the other one includes the others, the Chinas and the Russias? Will the G20 really continue, as Oliver said, to be functional? I think we see that the G7 is gaining a lot of prominence. It's been happening since last year, but also under this war has really brought that to the fore. The UN is, of course, something another institution to look at, in the sense, will it manage to have a role given Russia's veto power? And very interestingly, yesterday the General Assembly passed a resolution to that will require any power that uses its veto in the Security Council to have a debate with the General Assembly before or after it does so, trying to mitigate a bit this large blocking power that the veto is in for the UN, or rather obstacle. So the minilateralisms, I think, are flourishing. NATO is, by the way, also a multilateral organization, and that is also being reinforced. So I think all these minilateral, ideologically like-minded organizations are gaining in popularity and prominence as actors seek to hit to group together. The wider geopolitics, I think, are something to look at as well, in the sense of beyond multilateralism, the great power dynamics. And there, I think the big question mark is China. We've obviously all seen the 4th of February meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping, but a lot has happened since then, increasingly, I think, showing that China does not intend not to take Russia's side, but I'm not sure it intends to openly take it. But what does that mean in a range of policies, and how will it affect other actors as well? Because let's not forget that China has huge influencing power over others, and that's something to watch. And in the same context, of course, how are Western actors reacting to that? And interestingly, this past week, the EU has proposed a new arrangement to India, a new trade agreement, a new trade and technology council, something that I would say was not that expected some time ago. So is this also an opening to an actor that is able to sort of act as a buffer to China to a degree? That's also a big question mark. And then, of course, we have the Quad countries, which are in alliance with the US, but now increasingly also invited to the NATO summit. So we're seeing a lot of shifts in alliances and partnerships. And I think in this context, we will be living in a shifting global environment, and who makes the rules is, unfortunately, while it should not be put into question, and Brazilian foreign policy and the EU definitely stand by the international law as it is, but I think these different shifts and this instability that we're seeing may really be the beginning of something that is a new global geopolitical environment, as Oliver said. Last word on this: we should not, when talking about all this, forget that the domino effects of all this will also manifest in the developing parts of the world that we tend to forget when we talk about China, US, India, the EU. I mean, India is a developing part of the world, but it's huge. But there are countries in Africa, in Latin America, where the domino effects of the food crisis, the inflation crisis that is caused by these geopolitics, the supply chain disruptions, the coercive actions that may come by actors who are seeking new natural resources there may cause huge effects on the state of development, particularly if major actors are pulling development aid out to put it into military budgets. So we should really be keeping our eyes also on what's happening in those parts of the world as a result of this crisis, as you know, the root causes of conflict are usually more secret than we think, but then the domino effects are very manifestable in all parts of the world, and a new food crisis on top of a pandemic, on top of high prices in places like Africa, could be at the core of the next big crisis. So I will stop here.
Elena, thank you for you covered a lot of ground and brought a lot of food for thought. I have to resort to Ian to solve an impasse, I would say. The thing is, Kierkegaard has just joined us, but on the other hand, we have people raising their hands to make comments and to participate. So I will resort to the wise man among us, Ian.
Okay,
it's your call.
So Jacob and I have been in contact about this, and I think we have the solution, which is he's going to be very, very quick.
All right.
But he's going to leave us with just a couple of thoughts on the economic side of it, which might be useful, and then we can go straight into straight into the Q&A and everything
All
else.
right.
And so,
All right.
but I told him, Jacob, I think we agreed no more than 4 minutes. So there you go.
All right.
Thanks for joining
Jacob.
us, Jacob. We know it was logistically challenging.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I'm in. I've just landed at Heathrow, so I will just take off my camera, sort of in the interest of a degree of anonymity. No, and just on the economics of the war. I mean, obviously, war in general is both inflationary and devastating for the countries directly involved. If we're starting with Russia, the Russian government's own estimates now suggest that the Russian economy in 2022 will contract upwards of 10%. That is more than was the case in 2008, and takes Russia on the current level of sanctions close to the decline witnessed in 1992 at the breakup of the Soviet Union. So this is truly testament, obviously, to the scale of the sanctions and the devastating effect it has had. Ukraine, obviously, is a particularly terrible situation. GDP numbers are probably largely irrelevant. But I think the key issue here is that we've talked a lot about the cost of reconstruction. They're obviously in the hundreds of billions of dollars, but there's also an ongoing need for funding that will need to be covered by either international organizations or the G7 bilaterally, etc., if we want to have a Ukrainian government still capable of sort of being a government beyond actually fielding heavy weapons on the ground, etc. And their estimates probably range in the sort of $4, $5, $6 billion a month already. So there's clearly a financial need there as well. Then in the region, I think the biggest impact, very clearly to me, is in the EU. We have seen consumer confidence collapsing in the major economies, predominantly Germany. It's not only related to the war; it's also related to the increase in inflation that predates the war, but obviously has been now increasing with the commodity-related increases that we have seen. And I think what we saw actually today or yesterday with the Russian government now explicitly using natural gas cutoffs as a political weapon takes the euro area into a very dangerous situation because this is where we take the worst case scenarios because Russia has now cut off obviously gas from both, or threatened to do it at least, and clearly done it, from both Poland and Bulgaria. Indicating that they may be willing to do it for everyone involved, including, of course, also Germany. If that happens, there's no doubt that the euro area will be in a recession very rapidly. But I would go as far as to say even the threat level where we are today, I think a recession later in the year for the euro area is a very real prospect. It's very close to probably 50-50, if you ask me. Which means that rather than only talk about inflation in the euro area, we should actually also be talking about the potential of a short recession. And this obviously is greatly complicating for the European Central Bank. Fortunately, the direct impact further ashore in the global economy from the war is more, I would say, focused obviously on commodity markets, which I believe has already been discussed here. But then I think, it's important to recognize that the war, one disaster seldom comes alone, right? I mean, the war is happening simultaneously with a probably for global demand, even more important contraction of Chinese growth, Chinese demand, as a result of both the combination of COVID measures taken in China and the seemingly willingness of the Chinese government to let the renminbi depreciate vis-a-vis the dollar. So, ultimately what this means to me, staying a little bit on foreign exchange rates, is I think the euro, because it is a regional negative shock to the euro that doesn't really, isn't reflected elsewhere, and certainly not in the United States, means that there is further quite a lot of euro weakness out there. I think we're looking at parity on the dollar-euro exchange rate very rapidly, because it ultimately will be very, very difficult for the ECB to do, in my opinion, more than token interest rate hikes. And actually they are, again, because I view the risk of recession in the euro area as very high, I think they're really at risk of doing a kind of policy mistake that they did in July 2011, namely hiking immediately into a euro area recession. But again, as I said, ultimately the wars are inflationary, but certainly in the euro area, we are at the stage where this inflation is very quickly becoming demand destructive. And as a result, therefore, yes, as I said, I think the discussion should really be just as much about recession as it should be about inflation. A sentiment that I think is generally true also for the United States, but there it has to do with the general level of inflation that we've already seen, rather than directly the effects of the war. So ultimately, the significant downward revisions we saw in global economic outlook by the IMF last week, I think has significantly further to go, not only because of the war, but certainly significantly aggravated by it. So in that sense, it's a pretty bleak, in my opinion, overall economic outlook. I think that was about my 4 minutes, so let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob.
Jacob, thank you so much. We have two people in line. First, Eduardo Viola and then Bernardo Soares. Viola, you can go now.
Okay, thank you very much for by the excellent presentations, food for thought. I would like very quick to raise 4 points. First one is in relation to how Oliver point that the very important roles of the BRICS as supporting the Russian dynamic over the years. And I would like just to add that the BRICS has changed a lot in terms of authoritarianism, democracy, since it were founded, let's say. Because the trajectory of Russia was a kind of hybrid regime, and today is clearly an authoritarian regime. China was, before Xi Jinping, was in a process of relative political liberalization, very, very slow, but it was. Changed dramatically to Xi Jinping today, moving from an authoritarian to a totalitarian regime based on artificial intelligence. India was an electoral democracy 10 years ago, and today is an electoral autocracy, okay? And Brazil, the democracy has been deteriorated dramatically in the last 10 years. So I think there is a major problem here, that is the BRICS is today a kind of block of autocracies, okay? Some more than the others. Second point is in relation to what Oliver also told, is about Brazil. A major issue, because Brazil is in this kind of complacency in relation to the Russian war, is because of the deterioration of democracy and the deterioration of the center of the political spectrum. So we have a kind of extreme right, left, extreme left, that are not very committed to democracy. And 10 years ago, we have a center party, the PSDB, that was clearly committed to democracy, and values were relevant in foreign policy. And we can imagine that today the center is very, very reduced, unfortunately. But my question would be, if the center would continue being relevant as it was 10, 15 years ago in Brazilian society, the position of Brazil would be different, would be much more close to the Western alliance, okay? And the third point is about the change in the geopolitics of energy, that I think is very relevant, because we have, before the invasion, a globalized energy world, okay? And now we don't have any more this, okay? We have a major change in which the trend is clear to the increased interdependence between Europe and United States in energy, and the other side, increased interdependence between China and Russia in energy. And somehow we can be going in the direction of having a kind of an Eastern bloc, authoritarian bloc that is much more pro-fossil fuels, even with the fact that China is very ambivalent, growing both the renewables but also fossils, okay? And the Western bloc, particularly because of Europe, moving much more in the direction of decarbonization of renewables, and maybe with some impact in the United States. The immediate impact is negative in the United States, increase of forces pro-fossil interests, okay? But maybe in the middle term, this is different. And the final point is a question to Ian. I was surprised, Ian, you said that we are in the most dangerous moment since the 1945. But my question is, my feeling, all my study is that the 1962 missile crisis was much, much more dangerous than this moment, okay? So, but I am asking you if you can elaborate, why do you think that this is since 45? Thank you very much.
Okay, very good points, Eduardo. I presume Bernardo's question or comment is somewhat associated, related, similar to what Eduardo has said. So my suggestion is that Bernardo talks, and then we go back to the leading discussants.
Great. It is related, undoubtedly, but it's a different reading of what was being discussed, and also taking as departure point what Oliver said. When you read what are the analysts today, basically they speak in the West, of course, a confrontation between the West on one side, the authoritarian axis of Moscow, China on the other, and then there is a global South that is not taking clear positions. And I think that this is a very unhealthy type of analysis, because one side, we should also not mystify the so-called West. The West includes Hungary, Poland, and other countries, and even the States today is not in their best moment in the point of view of democracy. Then I think we can there's a type of return to a essentialized idea of the West, that are the developed countries, the authoritarian regimes, they are on the other side, and then this type of gray area of developing countries that don't take positions on are authoritarian or semi-authoritarian. So I think this is a very unhealthy situation. And in fact, I see this meeting as an effort to create bridges between the so-called West, because we, Brazilians, are part of the West. President Cardoso spoke about the far west of the West, but we are part of the West, and we should take care about a given situation that some countries feel the danger because they're Europeans, and America because they have this global strategy, and developing countries that can't afford, sometimes more, sometimes less. I'm not justifying precise political positions of different governments, including ours, please. I'm not discussing a concrete situation, but to understand that this type of analysis that confronts in one side the West, the other side the authoritarian axis, and those underdeveloping countries that are undefined, don't take clear positions, is very alienating from the point of view of the international order. Understand this meeting, and hopefully other meetings, to create bridges and understand that there is a global West that is not so cohesive as the European American today, because it wasn't so much some time ago. Then it's about creating this type of dialogue that we can produce a new environment that doesn't alienate countries like Brazil.
All right, back to the leading discussants. Maybe Oliver, you should reply to the comments. You go first, since you were mentioned several times.
Sure. I'll be very brief. Yeah, I agree with Bernardo's comment in a sense that not saying we should embrace analytically these divisions and essentialists visions of sort of the West against the South and all that, but I think it's we're clearly seeing that for countries like Brazil, and I'm not advocating here that Brazil, join the West in, for example, imposing sanctions. I think it's not in Brazil's interest, and that I think has the potential to create further tensions between Europe and the United States on the one hand and countries like Brazil on the other, just like it did in the debates about 5G and Chinese telecommunication technology. That for Brazil, it's an uncomfortable, the more geopoliticized the world is, the less comfortable it will be for countries like Brazil. I also think that Brazil has the tremendous diplomatic capacity to maintain its ties to all actors involved. I think it's the only country in the world that can be a G20 member, a BRICS member, a G77 member, and very soon a member of the OECD. So it does have that capacity, but it will be a challenge, particularly in a moment when Western public opinion will, and it seems to me that this is happening right now, is pushing for a profound rupture between itself and Russia, and potentially with China in the long term. Now, just one word about what Eduardo said. The BRICS, in a way, I don't think the BRICS countries are sort of pro-autocracy against democracy. I think more they're just pro-sovereignty, and to such an extent that the key principle that guides the BRICS summits is non-interference, and they have utilized these meetings in a way as a diplomatic life insurance, and that's why BRICS has been so important for Russia for years, because whenever people in Russia even say Putin is isolated, then he says, well, look at the All Smiles BRICS summit, and in a way, to some extent, even Bolsonaro, who's not well liked in Europe nowadays. I mean, Bolsonaro can't get a bilateral meeting today in North America or Western Europe. That's just a fact. And he had to travel to Hungary and Russia as in response to Lula's trip to Berlin, Madrid, and Paris, because those were basically the only countries in the regions willing to have him over. And Bolsonaro will continue to engage in BRICS summits. There will be one now in June in China. So in a sense, that also shows that this argument of why BRICS matters to BRICS members, that it's a guarantee in whenever they're being faced with pressure, that to some extent even applies to Brazil as well.
But let me jump into the conversation, Oliver, because if sovereignty is a major concern and a glue that keeps BRICS together, Houston, we have a problem, because Russia has just disrespect this basic principle. And what's your take in that respect? And specifically, how do you see the role of China? Does China see this as an opportunity to do the same further down the line with Taiwan and counting with a blind eye from the BRICS also How do you square these things?
Well, I think that the BRICS are being pragmatists. So that it's, of course, everybody in Brazil knew back in 2014 that Russia was violating Ukraine's sovereignty, even though Brazil didn't criticize Russia at the time. And so does China. I mean, it's really not at all ambiguous. But from a strategic sort of Brazilian, and again, it's not that I'm defending this position, but I think that's pretty much a consensus today, is that that participating in the isolation of other major powers like Russia is detrimental to Brazil's effort to balance the United States. Simple as that. And if that involves taking a step back and not really pushing hard on Russia, Brazil, by the way, abstained from the vote on excluding Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, then that's just the way it is. So I think there's a lot of pragmatism there. And the other issue, which I think is very dominant, I've participated in numerous sort of BRICS Track 2, BRICS summits, etc. There is lots of talk about Western hypocrisy as well. Lots of people say, Putin needs to be brought to the International Criminal Court. The problem is the United States doesn't submit to the International Criminal Court, so the United States' legitimacy to ask the international community to prosecute Putin is very small. It's very common questions in BRICS discussions to ask, like, who punished the United States after Iraq, etc. Again, I think that's somewhat simplistic, but it is a key element to understand why the BRICS are not sort of all, pushing Russia towards getting out of Ukraine right now.
Good. Two things now. One is I would like to provoke Elena to elaborate a little bit more on something that she has touched, which was pay attention to China, right? What is your take on how China is, because I mean, it has been a little bit ambivalent so far. And why it has been ambivalent, to what extent China will back Russia further down the line if Russia, for instance, escalates the conflict. And the other thing is, Isabella, you have written a long comment on the screen, and I would like to invite you to jump into the conversation and share your concerns with the other participants. But let's first listen to what Elena has to say.
Thanks. I think Jacob is the most China expert on this panel, but let me share my thoughts on your question. And they actually tie up to what Oliver was commenting on, the questions that came from the previous two commentators. Because I think China, I think what we've been saying, and in that context, we've been talking about divisions and the BRICS, etc., is that in every moment of history, we have a geopolitical dynamic scenario which defines how actors will behave, how states will behave. And in this scenario, I think what Oliver is also alluding to, and what everyone who talks about this division of democracies or the West and the South is that there may be a case now for foreign policy of individual actors to have to hinge between a dilemma, to bandwagon or to side with those that share the same approach on sovereignty and sort of democracy or lack thereof, those that they share ideological affinities with, or to continue being part of a particular system, globalized, open trade, because financially it makes for sense. And I think China is facing this dilemma as well, because if you look at China-Russia relations, I mean, the trade flows, the investment flows, they've been growing a bit. There could be potential in energy and food exports from Russia to China, but ultimately it's nothing when one compares to the trade and investment relations between China and the EU, or China and the US, or the two combined. So if one were looking at it pragmatically from an economic point of view, and I hope Jacob can support me on this, it would be a no-brainer if it was just about trade. It would be, the choice for China would be not to support Russia because of trade and economic relations with the West, with all the problems that exist therein. But But there's a bigger question there. Is what unites China and Russia in terms of ideology, in terms of their beliefs of how the international systems should operate and their own domestic system, the non-interference of others, the non-application of roles, is that stronger than, does it trump that? Does China see another way where it creates a new type of economic interconnectedness with other actors? So that's, I think, what the big dilemma is there, as it is for many actors. And let's not forget this division that we're talking about is a bit fictional, because when one looks at the economic and trade flows, the EU and the US are the major trade partner, and China, and for a number of countries. So it's hard to say they're disconnected. So I think that's going to be the China dilemma. I mean, this year, everyone who works on China says it's all about the domestic politics, and I would tend to agree. You know, it's about the party convention. It's about how she has handled the pandemic. So I think it's also, but it's also about the economic performance. So I think all these factors will be taken into account when China looks abroad. But eventually, a Russia that would have China explicitly supporting it would definitely be empowered in the context that we've been talking about. And of course, if all of the BRICS were aligned, that would definitely empower it more. But I tend to think that India has been engaged significantly by the United States and is currently being engaged quite a lot by the European Union. And while we may be talking about it, you know, the way that the BRICS want to be independent and sovereign, etc., I think if India gets more entangled into a trade and technology agreement with the EU and the US, and in that sort of system of approach towards technology, it may be part of another network or system of alliances. So that's also, I think, when we talk China, Russia, I think we have to also think of India as being the third big player in that geographical space.
Good. Kierkegaard, would you like to add something to what has said by Elena?
Yes, thank you. Happy to weigh in on it. No, I mean, on China, I think the first thing to recognize is, as Elena also mentioned, China is in the most difficult domestic economic situation that it probably has faced for several decades. The COVID outbreak is clearly not only extremely politically inconvenient for Xi Jinping in the party conference year, but we're now looking at well over 50% or approaching 50% of Chinese major urban areas facing variations of lockdown, which will be very detrimental for Chinese real estate developments, etc. What this means is that China at this point in time is probably more vulnerable to major changes in its external trading relationships than certainly at any other point in time in recent years. I think we're starting to see that with the effects of that, with the depreciation of the renminbi. But so far, at the same time, I think partly reflecting this, but also reflecting the scope of the sanctions geographically, China has not been stepping up to helping Russia in a technological sense or in a financial sense. In fact, major Chinese companies, including, ironically, Huawei, which is, of course, a company that has itself or is itself being sanctioned by the United States, has been withdrawing from China. China has not supplied critical technology to Russia. Or providing any kind of material bridge financing, etc. So overall, I would say, therefore, that while it perhaps is politically difficult for Xi Jinping to openly break with his only major geopolitical ally in the confrontation with the United States, namely Russia, Chinese corporates have been very happy to do it and are very happy to do it, and I think will continue to do it for exactly the logic that Elena also mentioned, namely that if you are a sophisticated Chinese corporate with global aspirations, why would you invest? Why would you put at risk a whole host of all your access to major advanced economies around the world for access to a declining Russian market? It doesn't make any sense, just as it didn't make much sense for companies to be in Iran if they were if they would be excluded from the US market as a result of that. So in an economic sense, I think China will stay on the sideline, while politically, will not openly break with Russia. But as I said, it won't certainly directly aid and abet the Russian war effort at all.
Good to hear that, Kierkegaard. Well, we are running out of time. Actually, we are already into extra time, so I would give the floor to Isabella Teixeira and ask her to be concise. You have to turn on your mic, Isabella.
Hi, Sergio. Thank you very much. I'm not sure about my comments, but I'm just trying to react here, consider the climate geopolitics and also how Brazil should come or not. I'm not sure. I'm really engaged today, considering the new debate on G20 on climate and the new strategic perspectives now and next year. We have a meeting next week in London exactly to discuss this. And also, I fully agree how European countries and also United States are coming together. And we're really worried about the decarbonization strategy or carbonization strategy that is coming concerning energy transition. So my personal opinion, and also have a third pillar, that this is new environmental multilateralism that will emerge from Stockholm Plus 50 conference now next June, and the role of a new dimension that is not a global one but planetary one, and how we indeed will manage the climate risks and environmental risks, consider the impacts of the war, because you know that we have a huge demand of natural resource, as mentioned here, and also how you come into the food security and also energy security, and the role of the green global south, that I used to say. And this is not clear enough. And I like too much who mentioned that Brazil, I think that was Oliver, that had the role to OECD, and also G77, and also G7 and G20, and also other BRICS, etc., and basic on climate change. But my feeling is that in my area, you have a lack of leadership, and also you have the problems today that the pressure that Bolsonaro government puts on these issues, and how indeed Brazil should use this, in my opinion, to manage better the green global south and to understand its role to move into this agenda and to be part of to understand better the impacts, not only short-term perspective, but in mid-term perspectives of the war. I personally, I don't like the idea to considering environmental issues and climate issues when you go this that we're dividing the world. This is the geopolitical reality, but for us, it's really a huge damage, because it will be really a complex reality to manage these issues, and also to understand better how you can use this agenda to have Brazil back, to bring Brazil back in the constructive position, considering international cooperation, international partnership, and also the tradition that we have, not only with the Western world, but also with the Western world, to come together in these agendas. So the picture is, we have a blur, if I can use the expression. As I mentioned, I know more about what's happened next week, because this is a close group that we're looking forward to debate exactly strategic G20. I'm very worried the comments that we have here concerning G20. It's really something very important to observe. And also, we cannot forget that Brazil has its important voice also to deal with inequalities and poverty. So the poorest countries in the world, that's mentioned here, the impact, how indeed you should come to influence or to facilitate some solutions. Finally, the political driver today in Brazil is not in this direction, and also the civil society, in my personal opinion, not necessarily has all the connecting dots to play strategically, and also to come to facilitate some bridges that we used to have in the considered European societies, also some Eastern societies, okay? But I think that it's an important agenda that you should learn more about these inputs that I heard here. And let's see how we can manage the next 2 months, these pieces, and how indeed we will come beyond the traditional multilateralism, but the environmental multilateralism is coming probably in new perspective and bring this new dimension, the planetary risks, not the global ones. And this probably will create some probably some reactions. And my feeling, I think that Biola mentioned this about democracy and autocracy, but I think that sovereignty, a green sovereignty, probably will emerge in this debate. Consider the interest, not only the commercial, technological, economic ones that are looking for to bring like-minded countries together. And I'm not sure about how Brazil will put this agenda or bring this agenda as a strategic issue for us, consider our development requirements, challenge, and more than this, our geopolitical role. If you want to have a geopolitical role, that's today's the one on climate geopolitics. Back to you. I'm not sure if I was clear, but I tried to improve here.
Thank you, Isabella. Look, I think we need to close because it's almost 1 o'clock here and much later in Europe. One final comment before I hand it back to you, Ian. I think this issue that was raised by Isabella, that Brazil can play a leading role in environmental issues, globally speaking, leads me to a final comment. I think contrary to what Oliver has said, in that specific respect, and it's not a minor issue, the October election here matters. Brazilian stance regarding this global issue will not be the same if X or A or B wins. It will make a difference. Anyway, I think the takeaway from this conversation, from our perspective, I think it's that we have already entered in a extremely complex and influx world order, in relation to which Brazil has no automatic alignments to neither one or the other blocks, which are shaping, reshaping, and in constant flux. That will require a lot of diplomatic skill from a country like Brazil to find our way in this new and brave new world. So this is the final comment from my end. Ian, back to you. Let me thank.
I'd like to say something.
Okay, Celso, you do that, and then Ian close the meeting. Let me just thank everybody who has participated in this very interesting conversation. Celso.
My only point is that Brazil has great diplomatic skills and Itamaraty has great diplomatic skills. They were stressed. But foreign policy is always very dependent on the president. And the president plays a very significant role in the way the direction of these skills are employed. So obviously, the case of Bolsonaro is very significant in terms of his approach to the world and also his affinities with Putin. If you think of the BRICS and you think of the summit when the Crimea issue came to the forefront, for Dilma and for those that supported, this was always an opportunity to play against the US presence. And there is a certain anti-Americanism that is related not to what the United States does, but to what the United States is. And this, of course, will play a role if, for instance, Lula is elected. In the case of all the issues of the environment that Isabella knows so well, if you are going to have these diplomatic skills at work, you have to have a president who will be able to handle this issue with the help of his collaborators, as Isabella was able to do in the Paris Convention, because she had the support of the president and because that was done in this way. If one looks at what the present administration does in this area, no diplomatic skill of any kind will help us in bringing something of a more constructive nature. So, and finally, as far as the BRICS are concerned, India has long relationships with Russia that are related to its conflicts to China. So that is also part of their view of things. I also think that China, if is capable of managing well this situation, will benefit from the relative decline of the United States. So they have a vested interest in the way both of them act. The only one that does not have a clear notion of what he is doing in the BRICS is the present Brazilian administration. But I end at that.
Very good.
Well,
Very good.
let me, actually, I know we went a little long, Sergio, and thank you all for staying with us, but it took a very, very interesting turn actually at the end, because in a way, it took us back to the subject of some of our earlier trilaterals, either in Brazil or ones we did virtually, where we were talking about troubled democracies and what was going on in politics. I mean, you mentioned upcoming elections in Brazil and the effects that this would have on Brazil's climate policy, but also globally, but also, the approach to Ukraine and Russia. You could ask the same question in the United States. We're going to have some interesting elections coming up. If you go through the thought experiment of imagining our response to the current crisis in a Trump administration or something like it, you could come to a different conclusion. Had Marine Le Pen won, on Sunday, we might have had a different debate about what European policy would be in the future. So the interplay between the domestic and the ability to deal with these big geopolitical and global policy issues is very clear. But we're not going to get to them today, clearly, although we started.
But
so
one more reason to carry it on.
Well, exactly.
In the future.
You're anticipating my thought about this, whether we're talking about climate or we're talking about security or we're talking about economics or other things. So we will do more. Let me also just end with our thanks to you, Sergio, and your whole team on the foundation side. It was a great pleasure to our speakers, to all, many friends to see on the screen. Very good to see you again. To my colleagues, also to Bill McElhenney in particular, and also to Alberto, who made this all happen on our side. We're very grateful. And our thanks also from GMF to all of you who joined. So, Sergio, thank you. Thank you.
And
again.
the conversation was so interesting.
Yeah.
That you've taken your tie off in the midst of the conversation.
This is my attempt to bridge latitudes. I can't just live in Brussels. I have to be an Atlanticist, Atlantic north and south, right? Not just a Washington-Brussels axis.
Much appreciated. Much appreciated.
It's a solidarity.
Celso, have you raised your hand, or would you like to say something else, or it was just no? I think it was unintentional. All right, folks. Great to see you. Great conversation. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.